Myself Asutosh Sajaria, and in this video we will cover BIOS and boot sequence. So first of all, what is BIOS? Full form of BIOS is Basic Input Output System. The system BIOS is the lowest level software in the computer. It acts as an interface between hardware, especially the chipset, processor and the operating system. BIOS provides access to the system hardware and enables the creation of higher level operating system like DOS, Windows, Linux, etc. So what are the components of BIOS? The first component of BIOS is BIOS ROM. The main hardware component of system BIOS is the system BIOS ROM itself. This is normally located in an EEPROM chip, which allows it to be updated through system software control. This process is commonly called flashing BIOS. Under normal scenario, the BIOS ROM is permanent. If for some reason BIOS ROM were to become corrupted, for example, you might find your computer left in a state where it could not be booted. In this situation, you might have to physically replace the BIOS ROM, but this happens on rare account. The second component of BIOS is BIOS CMOS Memory. CMOS stands for Complementary Metal Oxide Semiconductor. This is the type of technology used to make semiconductors like IC such as processors, chipset, DRAM, etc. CMOS has the advantage of requiring very low power compared to some other semiconductor technologies. This is why it was chosen for this use as CMOS RAM in BIOS. So that the amount of power required from the battery would be minimal and the battery would be able to last for a long time. The BIOS settings must be stored in a non-volatile memory so that they are preserved even when the machine power is turned off. The special type of memory is used to store this information called CMOS memory, and a very small battery is used to trickle a small amount of charge to make sure that data is permanently stored on this RAM. These memories are typically very small as 64 bytes. This non-volatile memory is sometimes called NVRAM, non-volatile RAM. Most of the motherboard allow to clear the CMOS memory when required, which helps someone set the CMOS password and forget it. In old motherboard, to reset the content from CMOS RAM, you just have to remove the battery. And in new motherboard, you can clear the content of CMOS RAM by changing the jumper setting on motherboard. So that's it for BIOS components. And the next topic is BIOS post. The full form of post is power on self test. The first thing the BIOS do when it boots the PC is to perform what is called power on self test or post for short. When the PC is first turned on, the main system memory is empty. It needs to find instruction immediately to tell what to run on startup of the system. This instruction it finds in BIOS program which is stored on CMOS memory. So let's start with boot sequence. The boot sequence is a process when we start the computer by pressing the power key on your computer and before starting the operating system. So sometimes it is called as post sequence also. The first step of boot sequence is when you turn the power button on. So when you turn the power button on, internal power supply turns on and initializes. The power supplies take some time until it can generate reliable power for the rest of the computer. Therefore, the chipset will generate a reset signal to the processor, the same as when you had the reset button on your computer case, until it receives the power boot signal from power supply. When the reset signal stops, the power supply will be ready to start executing. When the processor first starts up, there is nothing at all in the memory to execute. Of course, processor makers know this, so that processor always looks for pre-program. So the processor manufacturers and BIOS manufacturers came together and decided the common place or address on BIOS, so that all processors can look at the same address, at the same place in the system BIOS for the start of the BIOS boot program. This is normally the location called FFFF0H. This location just contains a jump instruction telling the processor where to go and find the real BIOS startup, and in the next step, BIOS performs power on self test. If there are any fatal errors, the boot process stops. The post beep codes can be found in the area of troubleshooting exam. In the next step, BIOS looks for video card. In particular, it looks for video card's built-in BIOS program and runs it. The video card BIOS is normally found at the location of C000H in memory. The system BIOS executes the video card BIOS, which initializes the video card. Most modern cards will display information on the screen about the video card. BIOS then looks for other devices' ROM to see if any of them have BIOSes on them. Normally, the ID or ATA hard disk BIOS will be found at C8000H and executed. If any other devices BIOS are found, then they are executed as well. Then the BIOS displays its startup screen. What it will display in startup screen, we will see after this process completes. And in the next step, BIOS does more tests on the system, including the memory count up test, which you can see on your screen. BIOS will generally display a text error message on screen if it encounters an error. Then the BIOS performs system inventory of sorts, doing more tests to determine what sort of hardware is in the system. Modern BIOSes have many automatic settings and will determine memory timing based on what kind of memory it finds. Many BIOSes can also dynamically set hard drive parameters and access modes and will determine this at roughly this time. Some will display a message on screen for each devices they detect and configure this way. BIOS will now also search for and label logical devices like COM and LPD ports. If BIOS supports plug and play standard, then it will detect and configure the plug and play devices at this time and display a message on screen for each one it finds. And then BIOS will display summary screen about your system's configuration. Checking this page of data can be helpful in diagnosing setup problems, although it can be hard to see because sometimes it flashes on the screen very quickly before scroll. Then BIOS begins the search for a drive to boot from. Most modern BIOSes contains a setting that controls if the system should first try the boot from floppy disk A or first try to boot from hard disk drive C. Some BIOSes will even let you boot from CD-ROM drives or other devices depending on the boot sequence in BIOS setting. Having identified the targeted boot device, BIOS looks for the boot information to start the operating system boot process. If it is searching a hard drive, it looks for master boot record at cylinder 0, head 0 and sector 1. This is the first sector of this hard disk. If it is searching a floppy disk, then it looks at the same address on the floppy disk for volume boot sector. And in the next step, if it finds what it is looking for, the BIOS will start process of booting operating system using this information from the boot sector. At this point, the code in the boot sector takes over from the BIOSes. If the first device that system tries, like floppy disk or hard disk, is not found, then BIOS will try the next device from the boot sequence and continue until it finds the bootable devices to boot the operating system. If there is no boot devices found, then system will display an error message and then freezes the process of system. So this process is called cold boot because the machine was off and you started the machine. A warm boot is the same thing except it occurs when machine is rebooted using Ctrl-Delete or pressing reset button. In this case, post is skipped and the boot sequence process continues roughly at 8 steps from sequence. As I told you, in one step of boot sequence, that BIOS will display startup screen. What it will display in startup screen? In the BIOS startup screen, you will see familiar screen display normally after the video card adapter displays its information. The first, BIOS manufacturer and version number. The second is BIOS date. The date of the BIOS can be important in helping you determine its capabilities. Then setup programs key. The key or keys to press to enter the BIOS setup program. This is usually delete or sometimes F2 or sometimes another key combination. Then it will display system logo. The logo of BIOS company or in some cases PC maker or motherboard manufacturer. Then it will display BIOS serial number. This is normally located at the bottom of the screen. Some BIOSes are highly customized to the particular motherboard. This serial number can be used in many cases to determine specific motherboard and BIOS version you are using. Now we will see the important question from this video. First of all, what is BIOS? Explain different components of BIOS. The next is full form of post and what is post sequence. What are the different ways to reset your computer? Mention the address for processor to start the BIOS program. Also mention the address for processor to start video card BIOS and hard disk BIOS, and explain cold boot and warm boot. So that's it for today's video. In this video we covered topic of BIOS. Hope you understood all about BIOS. Thank you.